London, winter of 1511. Smoke curled from the chimneys of Richmond Palace, where bonfires still smoldered in celebration of a prince's birth. The streets of England had echoed with church bells for days, ringing not for a coronation or a war won, but for a newborn child, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, the long-awaited son of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. He was the future of the Tudor dynasty, the promise of peace after decades of civil war, the boy who would inherit the most powerful throne in Christendom in the eyes of Europe. His birth meant that England was finally secure. Inside the palace, gold-threaded tapestries lined the walls of the nursery. The infant prince slept in a cradle carved from oak and adorned in velvet, guarded by wet nurses, physicians, and chamberlains sworn to his safety. His father, young and powerful, barely 2 years into his reign, visited often beaming with pride, cradling the boy in arms more used to wielding a sword. For a brief moment, the Tudor court pulsed with joy. Foreign ambassadors brought gifts of silk and relics. Fireworks were readied for the prince's first public appearance. It was a time of triumph, the kind of moment that monarchs pray will define their legacy. But by the 6th week, the laughter dimmed, whispers replaced cheers. The prince, once so vigorous, began to fade. He would not feed. His breath slowed, and on the morning of February 22nd, the cradle stood empty. The body of England's firstborn was carried from the palace under gray skies, wrapped not in royal silk, but in mourning cloth. No explanation was ever found. The death was sudden, cruel, and final. In the years that followed, that single death would unravel everything. The king's grief would turn to fury. His desperation for a male heir would fracture his marriage. Then his church, England, would break with Rome. Blood would flow from queens, bishops, and former friends. And all of it began not with a war or betrayal, but with the silence of a royal nursery and a child who never lived long enough to speak his first word. Under the gray skies of late 1510, England stood at a rare moment of calm. The Wars of the Roses were a recent memory, the battlefield scars of York and Lancaster barely healed. But on the throne now sat Henry VIII, young, charismatic, and newly crowned. At just 19 years old, he embodied the energy of a nation ready to rise again. Gone were the cautious policies of his father, Henry VII. In their place surged a new king who loved sport, music, architecture, and the idea of legacy. And no symbol of legacy mattered more than a male heir. A prince would mean continuity, a living seal that the House of Tudor would endure. Without one, every noble family with a drop of royal blood might begin sharpening knives in secret. Henry's queen, Catherine of Aragon, bore the weight of those expectations alone. She was no stranger to courtly duty or dynastic pressure. As the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, her marriage had once linked two great empires, but before she became Henry's wife, she had been the widow of his brother, Arthur, a prince who died young and left behind a queen and an unfulfilled alliance. That history hung over their union like an unspoken warning. The Tudor line was fragile, and England's enemies were watching. Catherine was 6 years Henry's senior, a Spanish princess who brought with her a dowry, political prestige, and a quiet strength shaped by years of uncertainty. Their first pregnancy in 1510 ended in a stillbirth. Grief was a private matter then, wrapped in prayer and silence, but the loss stung, and it renewed the urgency. Catherine's second pregnancy, announced later that same year, sent ripples across Europe. The Spanish court offered prayers, the Pope sent blessings, and in England, the people whispered hopes into the cold wind of winter. This child had to survive. As the new year approached, the capital prepared not for war, but for birth. Richmond Palace was scrubbed clean, its halls warmed by roaring hearths and guarded by noblemen who knew that what happened behind its walls could alter the course of Europe. On New Year's Day, 1511, the waiting ended. Catherine gave birth to a boy alive, healthy, and loud. He was christened Henry, named for his father and grandfather, and given the title Duke of Cornwall. Midwives wept with joy. Courtiers cheered. Henry VIII himself, so often the portrait of controlled magnificence, broke down and wept when he saw his son. There was no time wasted in broadcasting the triumph. Messengers rode through frost-covered roads with proclamations. Church bells rang across counties. Beacons blazed from hilltops. This was more than a royal birth. It was reassurance, to every rival and ally, that the Tudors would not fall. In a kingdom where infant mortality rates could erase entire family lines. The birth of a thriving son to a reigning king was a political miracle. Foreign dignitaries rushed to send gifts, swaddling clothes stitched in gold thread, carved cradles from Italy, and relics of saints to bless the prince's room. Catherine, despite the exhaustion, insisted on nursing the child herself for a time, a gesture of closeness not always expected of queens. She believed deeply that her role as mother was not ceremonial, but sacred, in the days that followed. She wrote to her father in Spain with quiet confidence. The boy had red gold hair like his father. His cries were strong. His grip, it was said, could tighten around a finger with surprising strength. Nurses reported long, restful sleep. The prince gained weight steadily. The court, so often a place of whispers and rivalry, now glowed with rare unity. Henry VIII had begun planning tournaments, masques, and public displays of splendor. A celebration like no other was already underway. For a brief season, England believed it had found peace through a child, but beneath the pageantry, time ticked forward without mercy. A baby born into a palace still faced dangers no velvet curtain could keep out. Disease did not respect rank. Fate did not play by royal protocol. And in a world where medicine stumbled in the dark, even the healthiest child could vanish before the ink dried on the birth announcement. But no one was thinking of that yet. Not when the future wore a crown the size of a christening cap, and the fate of a kingdom cooed softly from within a cradle of gold. By the middle of February, the atmosphere inside Richmond Palace began to shift. The chill in the corridors no longer belonged to winter alone. At first, the changes were subtle. A nurse noted that the prince had taken less milk than usual. Another mentioned he had slept longer than expected, almost unnaturally still. No one sounded the alarm. Infants had good days and bad days. And after weeks of celebration and vigilance, perhaps the household had let its guard down. But within a matter of hours, concern began to bloom behind closed doors. The prince's skin grew pale, and there were moments when he seemed distant, his small eyes no longer scanning the room, but fixed on something beyond it. He whimpered instead of crying. The chief physician, Fernando Victoria, was summoned more frequently, his footsteps echoing late into the night. The palace staff spoke in hushed tones, their voices tight with something they dared not name. Outside, the bonfires had long gone cold. The air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Catherine remained calm at first. She had endured too many trials not to master the art of poise, but even she began to press her ear to the nursery door at night, asking the wet nurse questions she would have never posed days before. Henry, in contrast, grew impatient, not yet cruel, not yet angry, just deeply uneasy. His son, the boy who represented everything he believed he was building, was faltering, and no one could explain why. One morning, the prince was found limp and feverish. His breaths came in soft, strained rasps, his tiny chest rising with visible effort. The tapestries in his room were drawn tighter, fires stoked higher, but nothing brought warmth to his skin. The Queen prayed by his cradle for hours. The doctors spoke in Latin, as if the language itself might shield the truth, but it could not, in a time when even minor infections could turn fatal. Medicine had little to offer beyond leeches, warm milk, and whispered hope. The last hours came without fanfare. There was no royal proclamation, no solemn gathering of the Privy Council, just silence, the kind that settles deep in old stone walls, too old to be moved by human sorrow. On the morning of February 22nd, the heir to the throne of England stopped breathing. A nurse screamed. The palace froze. And for a moment, the kingdom seemed to stop with him. Henry arrived too late to see his son alive. He was handed a body wrapped in white linen, still warm but motionless. No title, no crown, no future. Catherine crumpled when they told her. The woman who had carried empires in her blood now sat weeping on the cold floor of her chamber, her cries muffled by the heavy skirts of mourning. Word spread quickly among the staff, but the outside world heard nothing at first. It took time to craft the right message, something that would console, deflect, and keep the kingdom from unraveling. When the death was finally announced, the country responded with stunned quiet. No riots, no outrage, just a deep, collective stillness. Church bells rang again, but this time with a slower cadence. No one needed to be told what that sound meant. In every village, people bowed their heads in silence. In taverns, toasts were left unfinished. The Golden Prince, the child who was supposed to end all fears, was gone, and no one could say why. Within the court, grief curdled into tension. Henry was not a man who tolerated helplessness. He demanded answers no one could give. The physicians, unable to offer a cause, presented a cascade of guesses: fever, sudden infant death, divine judgment. None satisfied him. The king who had once wept with joy now withdrew. His joy curdled into frustration and suspicion. His court stopped celebrating. The masks were cancelled, the jousts postponed. The palace grew quieter, darker, and so did he. Catherine, meanwhile, bore her loss in silence. She had no sisters at court, no mother, no allies beyond her ladies-in-waiting. She resumed her royal duties within days, not because her grief had passed, but because she understood the stakes. The queen who could not provide an heir might not remain a queen for long. But no one could have known then just how much pressure that absence would create, or how many lives it would eventually destroy. In that empty nursery, beneath gold-framed tapestries and velvet drapes, a cradle stood untouched. Its occupant was gone. But the echo of what he represented lingered. Every footstep, every decision made from that day forward, would carry the weight of a child who never had the chance to grow up. And though no one could speak it aloud, something fundamental had shifted. A king had lost his son. A queen had lost her footing. And a nation had quietly begun to prepare for storms it had no name for. Yet, the funeral of the prince was unlike any seen before in England, though he had drawn breath for only 52 days. His departure demanded the grandeur of a king. The court moved quickly to orchestrate a ceremony that would mirror the weight of his lineage. The cradle, once gilded in celebration, was replaced by a coffin draped in black velvet, its size only amplifying the tragedy. It was not the procession of a fallen warrior or monarch who had ruled and erred. It was the farewell of a child who had never spoken a word, never taken a step, and yet carried the weight of a nation's destiny on his silent shoulders. Westminster Abbey was transformed into a place of shadow and firelight. Thousands of candles flickered against the cold stone, their flames swaying like mourners in a windless chapel. Black draperies cloaked the pillars, The air was thick with incense and whispered prayers. Nobles and clergy lined the nave, dressed not in splendor, but in somber robes, each trying to reconcile their public composure with the private despair clawing at their chests. The Queen did not attend. Her body remained too frail, her heart too shattered. The King arrived late, his face unreadable, his cloak dusted with frost. He stood beside the coffin for a long time, unmoving, as if willing the small box to open and restore what had been stolen. The ceremony followed centuries-old traditions. The Archbishop led the Mass with a voice steady but sunken, invoking the rites of passage meant for the old, not the newly born. When it came time to lower the coffin, the silence inside the abbey was complete. Then came the final act, the breaking of the tiny scepter. It had been crafted just weeks before, a miniature replica of power, shaped for a hand that never had the strength to hold it. Now, it was snapped in two, its sharp crack echoing through the vaulted ceilings like thunder from a clear sky. That sound lingered long after the burial ended, a reminder that a kingdom's hope could vanish as swiftly as breath in winter. Outside the abbey, London did not return to normal. The mourning period seeped into the rhythm of the capital. Court entertainments were suspended. Foreign envoys postponed their visits. Markets grew quieter. Even the Thames, flowing past the city like an artery of history, seemed to move slower. Within the palace, life did not resume it, simply waited. The women who had once prepared gowns for the prince's presentation now folded black cloth. The halls that had echoed with music and laughter now swallowed every sound. The king and queen, once so publicly affectionate, barely spoke. Servants avoided eye contact. Every door opened with hesitation. But beyond the palace gates, whispers gathered like frost along the city walls. The nobles who had once pledged loyalty to the Tudors in exchange for peace now watched with renewed caution. With no male heir, the line of succession became fragile again, vulnerable to factions, to old claims buried beneath years of enforced silence. Some recalled the Plantagenet blood still running in distant veins. Others murmured of Yorkist loyalties long thought extinguished. In taverns and churches, the people mourned, but they also wondered who would lead them now. If the crown could not guarantee its own future, Henry heard none of it directly. But power has a way of transmitting pressure without sound. In the hallways of Whitehall, his advisers stepped more lightly. In Parliament, voices grew more careful. The old fear, civil war, rebellion, the chaos of uncertain rule began to resurface, not in words, but in glances, in tightened lips, in the way letters were sealed with thicker wax. Within the court, grief curdled into tension. Henry was not a man who tolerated helplessness. He demanded answers no one could give. The physicians, unable to offer a cause, presented a cascade of guesses fever. Sudden infant death, divine judgment, none satisfied him. The king who had once wept with joy now withdrew. His joy curdled into frustration and suspicion. His court stopped celebrating. The masks were cancelled, the jousts postponed. The palace grew quieter, darker, and so did he. Catherine, meanwhile, bore her loss in silence. She had no sisters at court, no mother, no allies beyond her ladies-in-waiting. She resumed her royal duties within days, not because her grief had passed, but because she understood the stakes. The queen who could not provide an heir might not remain a queen for long, but no one could have known then just how much pressure that absence would create, or how many lives it would eventually destroy. In that empty nursery, beneath gold-framed tapestries and velvet drapes, a cradle stood untouched. Its occupant was gone, but the echo of what he represented lingered. Every footstep, every decision made from that day forward. would carry the weight of a child who never had the chance to grow up. And though no one could speak it aloud, something fundamental had shifted. A king had lost his son. A queen had lost her footing. And a nation had quietly begun to prepare for storms it had no name for. Yet, the years that followed the funeral of Henry, Duke of Cornwall, were marked not by recovery, but by an unrelenting spiral of disappointment and deterioration. Within the private chambers of the palace, Catherine bore child after child, each pregnancy a new opportunity for redemption in the eyes of a king who no longer believed in miracles. There were stillbirths, infant deaths, miscarriages each more devastating than the last, each pushing Henry further from the man he once was. By 1518, nearly a decade after their marriage, Catherine had produced only one surviving child, a daughter. Mary, bright, pious, and beloved, but not a son, for a while. Henry clung to the hope that Mary might one day rule, but the notion of a female monarch in England was fraught with peril. No reigning queen had ever ruled alone. A woman on the throne invited foreign influence, internal rebellion, and, worst of all, the perception of weakness. Henry's ambitions, military, political, dynastic, could not rest on such fragile ground. The memory of his lost son did not fade. It hardened into precedent, the standard against which every future child, every future hope, would be judged. None would ever match him, not in the king's eyes. By the early 1520s, Henry began to withdraw from Catherine not only emotionally, but physically. He ceased to visit her chambers regularly. Their marriage became ceremonial, politically necessary, emotionally desolate. The Queen, now in her late 30s, carried herself with grace, but the strain was visible. Her hair grayed early, her figure thinned. She clung to her religious devotion, sought counsel from confessors, and prayed for another chance. None came. At court, another presence began to grow in the king's orbit. Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting with French polish and English ambition, drew Henry's attention in a way no woman had since his youth. She was not the most beautiful, but she was clever, unreadable, and defiant. Unlike her sister Mary, who had once been Henry's mistress and faded quickly, Anne did not yield. She refused to become his lover unless she became his wife. It was a challenge that only intensified Henry's fixation. By then, Henry's desperation for a male heir had warped into something more dangerous. He began to believe that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. He claimed to have discovered a passage in Leviticus, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." To Henry, this was no coincidence. It was divine retribution. His conscience twisted scripture into rationale. His court was divided. Some whispered of spiritual punishment. Others saw political opportunity. Henry approached the Pope, requesting an annulment on the grounds that his marriage had never been valid. But Rome refused. The Pope, entangled in the politics of Europe and influenced by Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, denied Henry's plea. What began as a personal grievance escalated into a confrontation that would consume the English crown. The Church, and every soul tethered to them, frustrated, Henry turned inward and then outward, seeking counsel from figures who would enable his rupture from Rome. Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Cromwell, men not afraid of tearing down centuries of tradition if it meant pleasing their king. Together, they laid the groundwork for an act unthinkable only years earlier, the creation of a separate English church, one that answered not to the Pope, but to the crown. It was not merely a theological rebellion, it was the assertion of absolute power, and at its center stood the memory of a child buried before he had ever lived. When Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England in 1534, he did more than break from Catholicism. He severed his last remaining tie to the world he had inherited. The monasteries would fall next, their treasures seized, their lands redistributed, their abbots dragged into the mud of politics. Those who opposed the new order were branded heretics, traitors, or both. Even Thomas More, the king's former confidant, would lose his head rather than compromise his faith. Anne Boleyn became queen. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, another girl, another disappointment. Henry's temper flared, his hope waned. Anne would meet the same fate as others, who failed to produce a son, accused of adultery and treason. She was executed at the Tower of London in 1536, her body buried beneath the chapel floor, her name reduced to whispers. And still, no male heir. Through it all, the shadow of the first son remained, not in name, not in image, but in the shape of Henry's decisions. Every decree, every punishment, every new marriage bore the imprint of that original loss. England had not merely lost a child, it had lost a future, and the king it shaped in the aftermath was no longer the boyish prince of 1509. He had become something else entirely colder, heavier, more dangerous. A monarch forged in grief, ruling a country remade in his image. The transformation of Henry VIII from a radiant Renaissance prince into a figure of dread and tyranny was not an overnight descent, but a slow unraveling driven by loss, fear, and the cruel arithmetic of dynastic politics. Every child that died, every queen that failed to give him a son, every moment of silence where a child's laughter should have echoed, each one added another layer of stone around his heart. And yet it all traced back to one grave, barely 2 feet long, beneath the cold floors of Westminster. By the late 1530s, Henry had become a man few recognized. His frame, once lean and athletic, had grown massive and swollen with pain. An old jousting injury festered in his leg, leaving him in constant agony and increasingly immobile. His court, once lively with music and pageantry, now moved with caution. Fear etched into every step and every breath. The king's temper had become legend. One wrong word could end a career. A misplaced glance could end a life. The England over which he ruled had changed too. The monasteries were gone, dissolved under orders bearing the king's seal. Their wealth now flowed directly into the crown's coffers, funding fortresses and fleets, wars and weddings. Lands once held by monks now belonged to nobles loyal to the new order. The country had traded faith for favor, silence for safety. And yet, under this vast restructuring of power and religion, the original wound never closed. In private, Henry still spoke of legacy. He had married Jane Seymour after Anne's execution, and she, unlike her predecessors, finally bore him a son, Edward. Born in 1537, the child was hailed as a second miracle. The bells rang again. The court cheered. But the joy was short-lived. Jane died of postnatal complications just days after giving birth. The pattern repeated. A son arrived. A mother vanished, and the court returned to mourning. Henry buried Jane with a reverence he had never shown another wife. Her tomb would later become his own. But even as he celebrated Edward, the shadow of the first lost child lingered silent, unacknowledged, but always present. He married 3 more times. Anne of Cleves lasted only months. Catherine Howard, young and reckless, was executed for adultery. Catherine Parr survived him, but even she tread carefully around the moods of a man whose heart had been scorched by decades of disappointment. He ruled with increasing paranoia. Once guided by advisors and theology, he now trusted only his own instincts, however cruel or contradictory they might seem. His final years were marked by purges, executions, and a deepening distrust of those closest to him. The boy he had once cradled in 1511, the infant Henry, who had died in his arms, was never spoken of in public. There was no statue, no poem, no painting hung in the royal galleries, but he existed in every silence, in every marriage contract signed in desperation, in every prayer that went unanswered. He was the specter that haunted the Tudor throne, not through misdeeds, but through absence. Edward, despite the hopes placed upon him, would never reign long. He died in 1553 at the age of 15, sickly and unprepared. Mary, Catherine's daughter, took the throne afterward, and then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, who would become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. But none of them escaped the legacy of Henry's grief. Each bore the burden of a father's fear and fury, and of a dynasty built on blood and silence. The nation that emerged from Henry's reign was richer, stronger, and more centralized than ever before. But it had also been reshaped by violence and rupture. The Church of England stood not as a spiritual revelation, but as the residue of a king's personal despair. The crown sat heavier on every head that wore it after him, its weight compounded by the choices he made in the absence of his son. History would remember Henry IV for many things: his wives, his wars, his defiance of Rome. But behind all of it lay the quiet tragedy of a small coffin carried out of Richmond Palace one winter morning. That loss, barely understood by the public and unspoken by the court, planted the first crack in the foundation of a king's soul. The reign that followed, with all its might and magnificence, was built atop that fracture, and it never fully held. He was never crowned, never spoke, never even opened his eyes long enough to recognize the world he was born to rule. And yet, his brief presence sent ripples through centuries. Henry, Duke of Cornwall, lived only 52 days. But in those days, he altered the course of empires. His death was not the end of a life, but the beginning of an unraveling. The pain it caused reshaped a king. The silence it left behind echoed into parliaments, pulpits, and battlefields. From that moment, everything changed. The boy's absence became the void that power rushed to fill. It consumed marriages, shattered alliances, and incinerated centuries of religious tradition. In its wake rose a new church, a fractured nobility, and a monarchy that no longer answered to Rome. What began as the death of a child became the collapse of an order, and the birth of something entirely more volatile. There is no grave marked for him among the great kings of England, no equestrian statue, no gilded portrait, but his shadow never lifted. It followed Henry VIII into every chapel he tore down, into every law he rewrote, into every woman he married and buried. It stood silently in every empty cradle that came after. In the end, the most powerful king of his time could not conquer the thing he feared most: the quiet, the stillness of a nursery without breath, the hollow ring of titles meant for someone who never wore them, the empty throne of a son who never ruled. And so the story remains part fact, part echo, a question left unanswered beneath layers of velvet and stone. Did the death of one child make a tyrant, or did it simply give grief the crown? The answer lives somewhere between memory and myth, in a kingdom built on loss, and in the silence where a dynasty once dreamed of immortality.